Let me invite on stage Chiara Cappelletto, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Milan. Although she works at the crossword with performance studies, she's an expert in aesthetics. She wrote a book, actually, in neuroaesthetics. And she's very much interested in theater and the representation of the body and in what she calls performing identities.
So thank you. I want to thank Andrea for having come up with and organized this conference, in which I'm very glad to take part, and it's a special pleasure for me to speak at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Paris, a terrific institution where I spent some years ago, and that has been of great benefit to my research. So what I intend to discuss today is the idea that the mask contributes to our self-experience by problematizing our very identity. The mask is a material prosthesis that triggers a feedback loop effect, and in so doing, it challenges our sense of selfness or selfhood and calls our human nature into question. I will try to limit my argument to Western culture in our times. That is, I won't approach the mask from an anthropological standpoint, I won't discuss its ritual purposes, and I won't deal with religious beliefs, but rather aesthetic behaviors. And my presentation will take place in three parts: the twofoldness of the mask, mask as prosthesis, and split versus interchangeability. As to the twofoldness of the mask, by now, we mostly think of the mask as a double of the human face, as a surface that hides our secret thoughts, that conceals our most intimate passions, while at the same time presenting another person to those around us, and not necessarily a false one. The notion is exemplified by a family of cases, and we can take note of the family of resemblances between examples in this list. The mask stands for the reaction to comedian Kathy Griffin circulating the picture of herself holding a bloody Trump mask last year, has earned her a spot on the Interpol watch list and a 2-month Department of Justice investigation into whether the US government should charge her with conspiracies to assassinate the president. The mask expresses, Anna Magnani once told her makeup artist, "Do not retouch my wrinkles. It took me an entire life to make them come." And it is worth recalling that the word mask in Spanish is mascara, a term that refers to makeup for eyelashes, both in Italian and English. The mask conceals, the mask stereotypes, the mask iconizes, if I may coin a term, the mask deforms. This is the elephant man, both as the movie character and the real human being the character is based on. The mask replicates, the mask duplicates, the mask emancipates. This is Marcel Bascoulard, a painter and a clochard who lived in Bourges, and a city in which he was completely integrated, albeit living at its margins. And Bascoulard would frequently cross-dress, carefully choosing his fineries, and many of these pictures are autoportraits. The mask homogenizes, the mask identifies. I have no idea who he is, but this is Fiocchetti Mario, and the mask does all of the above. What all these masks have in common is the fact that they have the power to do. The power to conceal, the power to express, the power to homogenize, and so on. And notably, they have two kinds of agencies. An aesthetic agency. The mask is a visual prop that works as an index, which requires it to be seen. There is no mask without a spectator, and the mask as an identitarian agency, the mask makes its wearer present. You are the one who is hidden, the one who expresses, and so on. So the mask hides, but is unhiding that abolishes and identifies at the same time. Both agency, the aesthetic agency and the identitarian agency, link the mask to a role played by its wearer. The mask is staged and performs as a vicarious function, as is made absolutely clear in the law, where we have expressions like personam agere, to represent that person or even to act as that person in public. The mask then is anything but problematic to understand within the mimetic paradigm. It is an extension of and a variation of one's own appearance. And such an appearance rests on the presupposition that there is personal authenticity and that it coincides with the stability of self-experience. And therefore, it can be hidden, reinforced, or perverted. This clear understanding discloses a powerful iconic prejudice, whereby we conceive of the mask as an image, as a portrait, as a personal visual attribute. In point of fact, however, the agency of the mask no longer corresponds to such a visual dominance. This is possibly because our face has been photographed, overexposed, and now selfied for so long and with such an intensity that our face has lost its aesthetic power. Hans Belting, for example, makes this claim in his book Faces. I think that one of the questions being raised by this conference is, in fact, whether a face is still the aesthetic representation of what individuality is, as Simmel once taught at. At any rate, by now, face masks relate mainly to this and to that. Does this mean that the mask is an antiquated, outdated object? My answer, of course, is no. It's not an antiquated object because its agencies are still efficient, and they are still efficient because the understanding of the mask as a duplicate of the face leaves out one of its most important features. Masks are things that we hold, we display, and we wear. Masks are three-dimensional objects that are there to our face but do not coincide with it. And therefore, I call attention to a performative difference between a physiognomic mask that is a cover available to all, both living and not living. This is Sophia. Sophia is a robot presented at the Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh some months ago, to which Saudi Arabia has given citizenship and which many feel should wear the abaya. So a difference between a physiognomic mask and a bodily mask that works as a prosthesis. And this is to say that there is a performative difference between mask and masking. This difference does not depend on context, habits, intentions, and so on, but on an original property of the mask, and the property of splitting the subject to which it relates. So this property is already operative in its facial instantiation. I look at myself masked and I see a second vicarious person. I look at someone masked who look back at me so as to transform me into a thing, into a frozen expression, into a mask, as in Medusa's gaze. In fact, if the mask stands for someone else, this is because it has previously intervened inwardly in the subject. The mask is intrusive. And so I come to the second part of my presentation. The performative difference between cover and prosthesis is based on the intermediate position that the mask holds between indexicality and embodiment. The masking has less to do with our appearance than with the performance of our identity. And works of art depict this performance on a regular basis. It's seen constantly in novels, paintings. By the way, this one is by Giosetta Fioroni, and the title is L'altra ego, the alter ego. Films, cartoons, TV series, of course. But fantasy aside, what I'm interested in is to know if this performance is effective in a non-ritual world. Does this performance affect us? Does it interact with our so-called nature? And many artists have addressed this very question, all the while taking for granted the observed-observer relation. Many artists, in fact, deal with the issue of our interaction with animatronic objects, taking for granted that we are not like them. We are human, and as humans, we interact with these anthropomorphic creatures verbally, visually, and emotionally. This is Female Figure, a work by Jordan Wolfson, fitted with a motion sensor to recognize when people enter or leave the room of the gallery, allowing the animatronic to observe them. And if you stand close to the robot, it looks you deep in the eyes, and there is a disorienting moment as you experience yourself as an object of the automaton's gaze. And this other work has been made this year by Stefan Kegi. Stefan Kegi is a member of the theater collective Rimini Protocol, and he built an animatronic object that has the likeness of the writer Thomas Melle, which is this one. This humanoid takes the author's place and throws out questions like, what does it mean for the original when the copy takes over? Does the original get to know himself better through his electronic double? Do the copy and his original compete, or do they help each other? And this work is called Uncanny Valley. As we know, and yesterday Professor Berthoz recalled, as we know, this expression, the Uncanny Valley expression, was coined by the Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori to describe the fact that humans accept machines more easily if the machines resemble them physiognomically. However, if the machines are too human-like, we begin to feel mistrust. And this is Mori speaking. And as we can see from Mori's diagram, maybe I should go. As we can see from Mori's diagram, a prosthetic hand is not felt to be as embodied as a natural hand. It is experienced as an object. Let's try then to reverse the standpoints of the observed-observer relation and ask ourselves if this uncanny feeling can be self-referential, if it can itself be embodied. And a case study will make, hopefully, these questions clearer. So on the left, we have the handmade transformation mask crafted by the Heiltsuk people in British Columbia in 1860 or 1870 and worn at potlatches so that its human weaver was ritually transformed into a bird and seen as such by the people present. And on the right side, we see the technological transformation of a handmade mask created in 2017 by the artist Sean Hunt, who is himself a member of the Heiltsuk people. And Hunt collaborated with a Microsoft team to build a proper headset with HoloLenses. Hunt and his collaborators called this mask an experiential sculpture, and we will encounter this expression again later. By wearing it, the person was exposed to audiovisual stimuli and engaged in mixed reality, seeing holograms of the bird the person was flying in front of herself and hearing corresponding sounds. In the Transformation Mask 2.0, the human being inside the mask printed in 3D is not a bird, is not a masked man, but rather a cyborg for a limited amount of time. I would call it a pro tempore cyborg. this is, by contrary, a permanent cyborg. He's the first cybernetic organism that ever built himself somehow. He's Neil Harbison. So by now, thanks to anthropological and neuroscientific researches, we know quite well, we have just heard about it, that our bodily experience exceeds our anatomy, and that we interact with prostheses very often. And Andrea arranged my intervention to come after Olaf, so my task is much easier, and I can limit myself to quickly recalling two self-experiences that demonstrate the non-coincidence between the anatomical body and corporeal experience, that are the phantom limb and the rubber hand. And I want just to say that normally these experiences are defined as syndromes or illusions, but I rather prefer to call them eccentric experiences. And here I quote Helmut Plessner, who was an anthropologist and one that made interdisciplinary research even before that this term was coined. And Plessner described the peculiar quality of being alive for humans specifically as eccentric. I'm simplifying, but what he says is that each and every one of us is both the body that we are and the body that we have. The body that we are is our presence somehow, is the implicit experience of being alive in a normal situation. And the body that we have is the body on which we perform our actions, and is also the body that can hurt, for example, the body that calls for attention. And these two bodies are not in contradiction and do not ever completely coincide. And this non-coincidence is what is perfectly normal. This is the virtual reality box invented by Ramachandran. A man is invited to insert his right arm and his left phantom arm, which is hurting, and which he cannot move, into a box with two holes, and a mirror, but we just see it, placed in the middle reflects the movement of the right arm on the left side, and the left phantom arm starts to move. And the rubber hand experience, we just saw it, so I won't repeat the experiment. Even though the sense of ownership and the sense of agency are challenged here, of course, what interests me is the brief moment of conscious uncertainty, which turns into surprise. The man was laughing when he discovered that the hand wasn't his own hand. So this conscious uncertainty that turns into surprise and that we experience in relation to the mirror limb and the hand-like thing. It is the sense of uncertainty that arises when self-identification and self-localization are not yet achieved. I think so. Is this uncertainty an uncanny experience? Can we have uncanny experiences of ourselves as transmuting beings? Can we have the self-experience of being an artifact or an animal? And by the way, we could object that we can experience being animal only through interaction with artifacts. If we can experience being animal, under what conditions can it happen? This was, of course, the question that Nagel asked in his What It's Like to Be a Bat, where the exact problem was what it is like for me to be a bat without recourse to my imagination. Thomas Thwaites helped us answer this question. He's a British designer. He built the exoskeleton of a goat in order to walk the way a goat does, a rumen, to eat grass the way the goat does, and spent 3 days in alpine meadows, ending up exhausted, as you can read. And among his many goat inabilities, his pelvis was 135 degrees out of alignment. He did really that. So a first answer to my earlier question seems to be affirmative. Yes, we can have an uncanny experience of ourselves, because when we embody another animal structure, that is its mask, a feedback loop is triggered, thanks to which we deepen our eccentricity. No mutual assimilation takes place. Masks expand the original splitting of human self-embodiment. In the case of the goat man, we operate with a prosthesis. We have a mask that is integrated, and once integrated, it allows us to act as a goat in as much as we are a goat, so that we experience clearly the extent to which we are not a goat. Hence, we do not act qua goat, in the capacity of a goat. Thanks to this non-coincidence, we do not perform as if we were something else. We do not pretend to be, as is the case within the mimetic paradigm. We do not superpose identities, but expand behaviors on which we can reflect. We perform under a different clause, which is the what if. What if we were a goat? How would our environment change? How would we interact with our fellow goats? Very practically, how do we move our back leg to climb that mountain? And this what if is wholly performed by Amy Mullins. Born in 1975, she had both of her legs amputated below the knee when she was 1 year old. She's an American athlete, fashion model, and actress who appeared in Matthew Barney's The Crime Master cycle. She has 12 pairs of legs with different heels on which she walks differently. She has different negotiations with the ground under her feet. She can change her height. At parties, ladies have considered her ability to become taller at will unfair. And she plainly likens her prosthetic legs to the prosthetic birds of Pamela Anderson, it's not a joke, and considers her legs wearable sculpture. So that is a different kind of transformation mask. We can understand this performative self-experience in two opposing ways. As centrifugal, so her self-experience would be fragmented, dispersed, and dismantled. Who is she in the end? Or we can understand it as a centripetal movement. If we think of her selfness and of selfness in general as a dynamic process that must not be seen as the stable achievement of a specific character, but as a performance. How many eyes make her one? And I subscribe to this second understanding. Mullins states very clearly that her disability is, in fact, an augmented self-experience. It is, in her words, a super ability. And this super ability does not connote an enhancement, but rather articulates the possibilities of her self-experience. And she continues to perform her eccentricity through her legs, to which she must continue to adjust. This is the reason why Mullins is not Pistorius, who was disqualified from the 2008 Olympics for being too fast. Pistorius has assimilated his prosthetic legs, and this case is very similar to Jaron Lanier's. And here I come to my third and final point. In the 80s, Lanier, an American computer scientist from West Coast, as we can detect, worked out a lobster-like avatar, tracking movements that the user made in the physical world and rendering them as different movements of the avatar's body. Thus, an eight-legged lobster could have each limb powered by the rotation of a wrist, the flex of an ankle, or some combination of the two. In this case, we plunge ourselves into the bodies of others. We do not operate with prostheses anymore. We sense through prostheses by achieving a kind of reciprocal transparency. Indeed, the mask is not the lobster, but the headset remapping the homunculus. Lanier gives the term homuncular flexibility to humans' ability to control virtual bodies that are quite different from their own, due to the fact that the familiar mapping of the body represented in the cortical homunculus is only one option. We can act and perceive flexibly using quite other mappings. If people can learn to control bodies with extra limbs, human beings can change the affordances of the tools corresponding to the new body so as to change the self. Human embodiment is flexible due to cortical plasticity. Lanier has warned that homuncular flexibility is a dangerous idea because the more flexible the human brains turn out to be when it comes to adapting to weirdness, or as I put it, to uncanniness, the ride will be very tough when it comes to keeping up with technological changes over the coming decades and centuries. To conclude, in this research, in Lanier, for example, research perspective, I sense a teleological drive whereby augmentation and expansion amount to an inevitable diffusion of each and every living being within the environment, as if the situation with the goat was a step before the one with the lobster, as if we go from mask via masking to homogenization, immersion, or at least interchangeability with living beings. At the same time, it can be objected that my understanding of the mask as an uncanny prosthetic tool is too metaphorical and unable to state the difference between a proper mask and a pair of glasses. To respond, I hope, to both objections, I would say that while all masks are prostheses, not all prostheses are masks. Prosthetic tools are all functional, are all useful for, and the better they work, the less they drive an uncanny self-experience. The can I use to reach the ball under the sofa works the same way as my lobster headset. The mask's main quality is rather its temporary performativity, its ability to create a gap between the self and the self-experience, and its power to question visibly, openly, the very idea of stable selfness. Thank you.